World War I is taught as the war that ended all wars, a tragic but necessary conflict fought in muddy trenches by brave men who believed in duty and nation. The standard narrative holds that soldiers fought honorably, commanders made difficult decisions, and the world mourned the fallen before moving forward into modernity. But official war records were never meant to preserve truth. They were meant to preserve morale, maintain enlistment, and protect the reputations of governments that fed industrial machinery with human bodies. What follows are 22 facts about the First World War that were systematically removed, altered, or buried in archives that few researchers ever access. These are not theories. These are documented realities that were classified, censored, or conveniently omitted because they revealed a war that functioned less like a crusade and more like an administrative program of controlled attrition. The romantic image of World War I begins to collapse the moment you examine what happened to the bodies. Soldiers who died in the opening months of the war were often buried with ceremony and marked graves. By the middle of the conflict, the sheer volume of corpses made individual burial impossible. Entire battalions were shelled into fragments too small to identify. The official solution was not to stop the killing. It was to stop counting. Burial details were given quotas. If a trench was overrun and retaken 3 times in a week, the same patch of ground would contain bodies from multiple offensives layered into the mud. These men were not exhumed. They were walked over. Duckboards placed across flooded trenches were often laid directly on top of decomposing remains because the ground itself had become a kind of human compost. Soldiers wrote in letters that the smell never left their uniforms, their hair, their skin. They described the sensation of stepping on something soft in the dark and knowing exactly what it was. When rats became a problem, it was not because of food waste. It was because the rats had learned to chew through the faces of men who had been dead for less than a day. Orders were issued to reduce pissmany complaints about sanitation because such complaints were considered damaging to morale. The solution to the problem of mass death was not to prevent it. The solution was to make it normal. Military field hospitals were not equipped to handle the scale of injury produced by industrialized warfare. Shrapnel wounds were unlike anything medical staff had seen before. A single shell could send hundreds of metal fragments into flesh, bone, and internal organs. Soldiers arrived at field stations with their intestines exposed, their jaws missing, their limbs attached by strips of tissue. The standard protocol was triage by probability of survival. Men who were conscious but missing limbs were often left in holding areas for hours because surgeons were instructed to prioritize soldiers who could return to the front. This was not cruelty. This was efficiency. Amputations were performed without sufficient anesthetic because supply lines could not keep pace with the rate of injury. Soldiers were held down by orderlies, while limbs were sawed off in under 3 minutes. The limbs were thrown into bins that were emptied twice daily. A nurse stationed at a casualty clearing station in France wrote in her private diary that the pile of amputated arms and legs outside the surgical tent grew taller than a man by the end of some days. She was reprimanded when a censored version of her correspondence was flagged for defeatist content. Her diary was confiscated and she was reassigned. The entry itself was removed from her file after the war. Shell shock was not recognized as a medical condition until thousands of men had already been executed for cowardice. Soldiers who froze under bombardment, who could not stop shaking, who wept uncontrollably or refused orders, were court-martialed and shot by their own side. The British Army alone executed over 300 men for cowardice or desertion during the war. Many of them were teenagers. Some had been in the trenches for less than a month. The executions were carried out at dawn by firing squads composed of men from the condemned soldiers' own unit. This was deliberate. It reinforced the idea that disobedience was a betrayal of your brothers, not a failure of your mind. Medical officers who tried to advocate for soldiers displaying symptoms of psychological trauma were quietly removed from their posts. The official position was that fear was a moral failing, not a neurological response to prolonged exposure to death. Even after shell shock was reluctantly acknowledged, treatment was rudimentary. Men were subjected to electroshock therapy, cold water immersion, and isolation. The goal was not to heal them. The goal was to make them functional enough to return to combat. Records show that soldiers who were treated for shell shock and sent back to the front had a significantly higher rate of death within 2 weeks of return. This was not considered a failure of the treatment. It was considered a necessary trade-off. Gas warfare was publicly condemned as inhumane, but every major power used it extensively and continued to develop more lethal variants throughout the war. The first gas attacks were chlorine-based and caused men to drown in their own fluids as their lungs filled with liquid. Soldiers described the sensation of suffocating while still breathing. Mustard gas, introduced later, did not kill quickly. It caused blistering of the skin, blindness, and internal burns that took days or weeks to kill a man. Survivors often lived for years afterward with destroyed respiratory systems and recurring infections. The real horror of gas was not its lethality. It was its unpredictability. Wind could blow gas back onto the troops who deployed it. Entire units were incapacitated by their own weapons. Orders were given to continue gas attacks even after it became clear that atmospheric conditions made them as dangerous to the attacker as the defender. The reasoning was strategic. Gas created psychological terror. Even if it did not kill, it degraded combat effectiveness and forced enemy troops to wear masks that reduced visibility and communication. The long-term health effects were never recorded in official casualty statistics. A soldier who died of lung disease 5 years after the war ended was not counted as a war death. Governments were aware of this gap and did nothing to close it. Soldiers were lied to about the duration of their service. Enlistment papers promised terms of 2 or 3 years, but extensions were applied retroactively as the war dragged on. Men who believed they were months away from demobilization were told their service had been extended indefinitely. There was no legal recourse. Mutinies occurred in multiple armies when soldiers realized they had no release date. The French army experienced mass mutinies in the spring of 1917 after a series of catastrophic offensives. Entire divisions refused to attack. The mutinies were suppressed not through negotiation, but through summary execution. Ringleaders were shot within hours of being identified. The mutinies were erased from official French military history for decades. Details only emerged when private letters and suppressed court-martial records were declassified in the late 20th century. The official narrative during the war was that morale remained high and that the French soldier was unshakable in his devotion to la patrie. The truth was that men were held in place by the threat of death from their own officers. Trench foot was not a minor inconvenience, it was a gangrenous condition that required amputation in thousands of cases. Feet exposed to cold, wet conditions for prolonged periods would begin to rot. The flesh would turn black and slough off. The smell was so distinctive that medical officers could diagnose it from across a tent. Prevention required dry socks and regular rotation out of flooded trenches, but neither was feasible, given the manpower shortages and the static nature of trench warfare. Soldiers were ordered to remain in position, even as their feet decomposed inside their boots. Some men cut their boots off and found their toes had already separated from their feet. Company commanders were instructed not to report trench foot cases above a certain threshold because it reflected poorly on their leadership. Men with early-stage trench foot were kept in the line. By the time they were evacuated, amputation was often the only option. The condition was so common that field hospitals had dedicated wards for it. Soldiers joked bitterly that you could lose your feet without ever seeing the enemy. The concept of no man's land as an empty buffer zone is a sanitized myth. No man's land was a graveyard. Bodies accumulated in the space between trench lines because retrieval was suicide. Snipers waited for stretcher bearers. Soldiers who went over the top to recover a wounded friend were often killed before they could return. Over time, the bodies became part of the landscape. They were used as landmarks. Soldiers would navigate by identifying a corpse they recognized from previous patrols. Some bodies remained in no man's land for years. They were shelled repeatedly until nothing recognizable remained. Photographs taken after the war show bones mixed into the soil of former battlefields. Farmers plowing fields in Belgium and France still unearth human remains today, more than a century after the armistice. During the war, no attempt was made to recover these bodies. Orders explicitly forbade rescue operations during daylight. Night recovery missions were rare and usually conducted only when a corpse was blocking a firing position. The dead were left where they fell because the war could not pause for burial. Horses suffered more than soldiers in some sectors of the war. Over 8 million horses died during World War I. They were used to haul artillery, supplies, and ambulances through mud that could swallow a man whole. Horses broke their legs and were shot where they fell. They died of exhaustion, disease, and shrapnel. Unlike soldiers, they received no medical care beyond what was necessary to keep them working. A horse that could no longer pull a gun was killed immediately. Their bodies were left to rot or were butchered for food when rations ran low. Soldiers reported that the sound of a horse screaming in pain was worse than the sound of a man screaming. Orders were given to shoot injured horses quickly, not out of mercy, but because the noise was bad for morale. Veterinary corps existed, but they were understaffed and under-resourced. Horses were considered equipment, not casualties. Their deaths were logged in supply reports, not death tolls. The industrial scale of animal death has been largely omitted from mainstream histories of the war. Officers were more likely to die than enlisted men in the early months of the war, but this changed as tactics evolved. Initial offensives were led from the front, and junior officers were expected to be the first over the trench wall. Casualty rates among lieutenants and captains were staggering. Entire classes from British military academies were wiped out in single engagements. This created a leadership crisis that was solved by promoting men with less training and pulling officers back from the front lines. By the middle of the war, command posts were located miles behind the trenches. Generals planned offensives from chateaus with gardens and staff dinners, while the men they commanded lived in holes filled with freezing water. The disconnect was not accidental. It was doctrinal. High command believed that emotional detachment produced better strategic decisions. Orders were issued with no consideration for the conditions under which they would be carried out. Soldiers were told to advance across open ground into machine gun fire because the map said the objective was 400 yards away. The map did not show the mud, the wire, or the craters. When offensives failed, the fault was placed on the soldiers for lacking aggression, not on the commanders for ordering the impossible. Disease killed more men than combat in several theaters of the war. Dysentery, typhus, and cholera spread through trenches where human waste mixed with drinking water. Latrines were shallow pits that overflowed when it rained. Soldiers drank from contaminated shell holes because supply lines could not deliver clean water. Illness was so common that it stopped being reported unless it incapacitated entire units. Men with dysentery were expected to remain in the line. They collapsed in the trenches and soiled themselves because there was no time or place to relieve themselves properly. Medical officers recorded tens of thousands of cases of preventable disease, but the reports were classified to avoid public scandal. Families were told their sons died in combat, when in reality they had died of infected water or lice-borne fever. The lice themselves were a plague. Every soldier had them. They lived in the seams of uniforms and could not be removed. Soldiers would burn the seams of their clothes with candles to kill the lice, but new lice appeared within hours. The itching was maddening. Some men scratched themselves until they bled. Trench fever, transmitted by lice, caused high fever and severe pain. It was not fatal, but it was incapacitating. Hundreds of thousands of cases were recorded, but because men usually recovered, trench fever was not treated as a serious condition. The use of flamethrowers was more widespread than official records indicate. Flamethrowers were considered a psychological weapon. The sight of a man burning alive caused enemy troops to flee even when they were in fortified positions. The weapon was horrifying to deploy and horrifying to face. Operators of flamethrowers had a life expectancy measured in minutes once they entered combat. They were priority targets. Soldiers hit by flamethrowers did not die instantly. They burned for minutes or longer. The screams could be heard across the battlefield. Other soldiers were ordered not to help them, because stopping to assist a burning man made you a target. Men who survived flamethrower attacks were often so disfigured that they were hidden from public view for the rest of their lives. Hospitals had entire wards dedicated to burn victims who would never recover enough to leave. These men were not included in official disability statistics because their injuries were considered too severe to rehabilitate. Some were kept in institutions for decades. Their existence was not acknowledged in post-war literature. Flamethrower use was minimized in official accounts because it was difficult to reconcile with the image of honorable warfare. Surrendering was not safe. Soldiers who raised their hands were often shot anyway. This happened on all sides. The justification was that accepting surrender slowed an advance, or that the enemy might be feigning surrender to launch a counterattack. In practice, many soldiers simply did not want to take prisoners. Prisoners required guards, food, and transport. It was easier to kill them. Orders were rarely written down, but the practice was widespread. After major offensives, battlefield reports would note that no prisoners were taken, despite evidence that enemy troops had attempted to surrender. Courts-martial for killing prisoners were rare and usually only occurred when the act was witnessed by an officer who objected. Even then, convictions were uncommon. The logic was that war eliminated the normal rules of behavior. A man who killed a surrendering enemy was not a murderer. He was a soldier doing what soldiers do. This attitude extended to wounded enemy soldiers as well. Men lying in no man's land calling for help were sometimes finished off by patrols. This was considered a mercy in some cases and an efficiency in others. The artillery barrages that preceded major offensives were not designed to destroy the enemy. They were designed to break the human nervous system. Bombardments could last for days. Shells fell continuously, day and night, in a rhythm that made sleep impossible. Men trapped in dugouts during a bombardment described the experience as being buried alive in an earthquake that never stopped. The sound was so loud that it caused permanent hearing loss. Soldiers went deaf in one or both ears. The concussive force of nearby explosions caused internal injuries without visible wounds. Men bled from their noses and ears. They vomited. They lost control of their bowels. Some lost their minds entirely. They would sit unresponsive, staring at nothing. These men were classified as shell shock cases if they were lucky. If they were not lucky, they were classified as malingerers and sent back into the bombardment. The psychological impact of sustained artillery fire was understood by commanders. It was part of the strategy. The goal was not to kill everyone in the trench. The goal was to ensure that anyone who survived was no longer capable of effective resistance. When the barrage lifted and the infantry advanced, they were often met by men too shattered to fight back. Battlefield executions for cowardice were carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. A soldier accused of desertion or refusing orders was given a brief court-martial, often lasting less than an hour. There was no real defense. The outcome was predetermined. Execution was scheduled for the following dawn. The condemned man was tied to a post or a tree. A piece of paper was pinned to his chest over his heart to give the firing squad a target. The squad was usually composed of men from his own unit. Sometimes the rifles were loaded with blanks so that no one knew who fired the fatal shot, but this was not always the case. The condemned man was not blindfolded unless he requested it. After the execution, the body was buried in an unmarked grave. Family members were told that their son or husband had been killed in action. The records were sealed. It was only decades later, after pressure from historians and veterans groups, that the names of executed soldiers were released. Some of those men were as young as 16. They had lied about their age to enlist. They were children who broke under conditions that would have broken anyone. The concept of rotation out of the front lines was inconsistent and often a lie. Soldiers were promised relief after a certain number of days in the trenches, but relief depended on available reserves. If no reserves existed, men stayed in the line indefinitely. Some units spent months in continuous combat without rotation. The effect on mental and physical health was catastrophic. Men stopped caring whether they lived or died. This was not bravery. It was exhaustion so total that survival instinct disappeared. Soldiers would stand upright during shelling because they no longer had the energy to take cover. They would walk slowly across open ground because running required effort they did not have. Officers observed this phenomenon and reported it as fatigue, but no systemic solution was implemented. The machine needed bodies, and bodies were kept in place until they stopped functioning. Chlorine gas, phosgene, and mustard gas were only the beginning. Experimental chemical agents were tested on animals, and in some cases on prisoners of war. These tests were classified and remain partially redacted even in declassified archives. The goal was to develop a gas that could penetrate existing masks and cause immediate incapacitation. Some of these agents caused neurological damage, others caused prolonged, agonizing death. The experiments were justified as necessary to stay ahead of the enemy, who was assumed to be conducting similar research. Evidence suggests that both sides tested chemical weapons that were never deployed on a large scale, not because of moral objection, but because they were deemed too unpredictable, or because the war ended before production could be scaled. Soldiers exposed to experimental agents during testing were not tracked. Their medical records were destroyed or altered. Cannibalism occurred in isolated pockets of the war, particularly in sieges and encirclements where supply lines were cut for extended periods. There are documented cases on the Eastern Front and in colonial theaters where troops were trapped without food for weeks. Official reports do not use the word cannibalism. They refer to extreme measures taken to sustain life or breakdowns in discipline. Letters and diaries from soldiers in these situations describe finding evidence that bodies had been mutilated for food. These accounts were suppressed. The families of soldiers who died in these conditions were never told. The men who survived and spoke about it were discredited or ignored. Cannibalism was not widespread, but it occurred, and it was covered up because it was incompatible with the image of civilized nations at war. Medical experiments were conducted on wounded soldiers without their consent. Surgeons used the war as an opportunity to test new techniques in reconstructive surgery, blood transfusion, and infection control. Soldiers were not asked if they wanted to participate, they were simply operated on. Some of these experiments were successful and advanced medical science, others were catastrophic. Men died on operating tables during procedures that were experimental and unnecessary for their immediate survival. The justification was that the knowledge gained would save future lives. Consent was considered irrelevant. The soldiers were already government property. Their bodies could be used as needed. Records of these experiments exist in medical journals published after the war, but the lack of consent is never mentioned. The soldiers are referred to as subjects or cases, not as human beings with agency. The armistice did not end the dying. Soldiers continued to die from wounds, disease, and malnutrition for months after the guns stopped. Hospitals were overwhelmed with men who had been holding on just long enough to see the war end. Many of them did not survive the winter. The influenza pandemic of 1918 killed millions, including soldiers who had survived 4 years of combat. The pandemic spread rapidly through demobilization camps, where men were packed into close quarters waiting to go home. Some soldiers survived the trenches only to die of flu in a tent in France a week before their transport home. These deaths were not counted as war deaths, but they were a direct result of the conditions created by the war. The collapse of public health infrastructure, the movement of millions of men across borders, and the weakened immune systems of soldiers all contributed to the scale of the pandemic. Mass graves were dug in areas where individual burial was impossible. Entire companies were buried together in pits. Wooden markers were placed, but these rotted or were destroyed in subsequent fighting. After the war, efforts were made to create cemeteries and memorials, but many bodies were never recovered. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of soldiers have no known grave. Their names are listed on monuments, but their remains are still in the ground where they fell, mixed with soil and debris. Families were told their loved ones were missing, presumed dead. There was no body to bury, no closure. The scale of the missing is so large that it defies comprehension. Entire villages in Britain lost all their young men. Memorials list dozens of names from communities of a few hundred people. The social and demographic impact of this loss was catastrophic, but it was absorbed quietly. Grief became a permanent state, not an event. The Treaty of Versailles did not address the human cost of the war. It focused on borders, reparations, and blame. The men who fought were not consulted. The men who died were not counted in any meaningful way. The war had demonstrated that human life could be spent like currency, and the post-war order did nothing to challenge that logic. Disabled veterans were given pensions that were insufficient to live on. Men with no legs begged on street corners. Men with no faces were kept out of sight. The societies that sent them to war did not want to look at what came back. Memorials were built to honor sacrifice, but they were also built to move on. The dead were frozen in bronze as young and whole. The living were expected to disappear. World War I did not end because anyone won. It ended because the machinery of attrition ran out of fuel. Empires collapsed. Populations were exhausted. Soldiers stopped obeying orders in sufficient numbers that continuing was no longer possible. The armistice was not a moral reckoning. It was a logistical conclusion. The war had normalized industrial-scale death, bureaucratic indifference to suffering, and the treatment of human beings as resources to be expended. Those norms did not disappear. They carried forward into the next war, and the wars after that. The official records were sanitized, the photographs were selected, and the stories were shaped into something that could be taught to children without causing nightmares. But the truth was written in the bones still buried in the fields, in the medical files that were classified for 100 years, and in the silence of the men who came back and never spoke about what they had seen.